All right, so we're out here in the garden today, and you've been planning your garden for months, and you go out and you meticulously start your seeds, and you lovingly raise them up and start getting them ready, and you go out and you buy you go to your local hardware or your local plant store or your local garden center, and you buy yourself some soil, and it says organic on it, and I'm going to go all organic this year, and you pick it up and you put it in your raised bed, and you go out and get yourself some organic fertilizers, and this is going to be great. I'm going to grow nice healthy vegetables this year, and everything is going to be really great, and I'm going to do it as organically as possible. And then all of a sudden you start getting into the process, and your plants start to fail. Why is this? What happened? I went out and got the organic stuff. I went out and got the right fertilizers. I did all this stuff. Why are my plants failing? Well, one thing they don't tell you is those soils that you buy and those composts that you buy at those garden centers and stuff really aren't ready to process organic fertilizers, and they're basically biologically, I'm not going to say sterile because they're not technically sterile, but for all intents and purposes for what you're trying to do, they're essentially sterile. They lack all the worms that you need. They lack the funguses that you need. They lack the soil bacteria that you need. They lack all the little bugs and the whole ecosystem. When you're trying to grow something organically and using organic inputs, you're really creating, much like in my aquaponic system, what you're doing is you're creating an ecosystem, a miniature ecosystem. And the problem is, and they don't tell you this, is these ecosystems actually take time to start functioning properly. How much time? Well, that's going to kind of depend on the way you're set up and how you're doing it. I'm going to call it a mistake, but I don't really know if it's technically a mistake, but it's kind of a mistake, is they'll put their raised beds down, and then they put this cardboard down, and then they fill it up. If there's a relatively short bed, they'll fill it up, and then they start to wonder, okay, what's going on with my bed? I don't understand why things aren't working. I did what everybody told me to do. Well, again, what's happened is by putting the barrier on the bottom, you've stopped the transfer of the soil life that's below that from getting up into the bed. And people will do this to help prevent weeds, where the reality is weeds are just part of gardening. It's just part of the game. You're just going to have to accept the fact that you might have to pull a few weeds. And in fact, in a lot of ways, the weeds aren't necessarily even a bad thing. Most of those weeds and stuff, if you take them and just cut them off, and you can just throw them back into the garden, and they just start helping with the soil. But I digress a little bit there. Giving these things the amount of time that they actually require in order to start to function properly is very important. One of the things you can kind of do to sort of sidestep things a little bit is you can introduce homemade compost if you have a source of homemade compost, you can kind of introduce some of that into your raised bed. And it doesn't even have to be a whole lot. Even if you can just ask a neighbor for, a few handfuls, something to inoculate the soil with and get things kind of moving along is going to help you a lot. There are a lot of videos out there that teach people how to make IMO, indigenous microorganisms. Those will also help get things started. But in the end, the bottom line is these things take a lot of time in order for them to properly start working and properly start breaking down your organic fertilizers. So what can you do in the meantime? Well, you can go out and you can get some of the water soluble fertilizers that will help. There are things like, and I haven't tried this particular one, but I've heard a lot of good stuff about it, is Jack's 20-20-20. That's supposed to be pretty good, and that would be a good one to start with. You can go out and buy some fish fertilizer, although personally I think fish fertilizer that we buy in the stores it's a good product. It's just pretty expensive for what you're actually getting, and if you're doing a lot of gardening, that cost is going to run up pretty quick. So I can't not recommend it because it is something, but it's just not the cheapest way that you can go, and it's not necessarily the most effective way that you can go, because it still requires some soil bacteria and stuff to finish up the product and keep it going. You can go with some on a short-term thing, just until things kind of kick off a little bit. You can try some synthetic fertilizers, something like Miracle Grow all-purpose or things like that. That'll get your plants at least established and help things get moving along. These things don't kill your soil life and stuff, as long as you're feeding that soil the organic stuff. A little bit of synthetic fertilizer in there isn't going to affect the biology of your soil. One of the misconceptions, I'm going to call it, that people have about synthetics, and you see a lot of stuff online, is they'll say things like, too much synthetic fertilizer ends up killing the soil and all that stuff, and this is why farmers have to use so much of it. And that's true. The problem with that they're having is they don't continue to feed the soil and the organisms in that soil in order to get over that hump of needing so much synthetic fertilizers. So what they end up doing is basically starving out the majority of the soil life. If you don't have something dead and decaying in the soil, that fungus it won't grow, it just can't. And without the fungus, you're not going to have the different microorganisms, you're not going to have the necessary nematodes, you're not going to have all the soil bacteria that's needed, and that's what really ends up happening. Where in our gardens here, if we keep adding the organic stuff into the soil and we have to put a little temporary synthetic fertilizer into the soil to kind of get our brand new beds kicked off, you're not going to be killing any bacteria or anything. And in the end, the synthetic fertilizers actually what the plant ends up using from those synthetic fertilizers is exactly the same thing as you would have gotten from your organic fertilizers anyway. The plants don't know if it's synthetic or not. It's still going to bring up the same thing. Probably the biggest problem with synthetic fertilizers isn't necessarily the fertilizer itself. It's more the manufacturing process. By the way, I've talked a little bit about synthetic fertilizers, and I am by no means endorsing a synthetic fertilizer. I'm just stating the fact that if you're having problems with your new bed and you're trying to grow some food for yourself in the new bed, that might help you get over the hump while your bed is actually, I'm going to call it cycling, or actually establishing itself so that it can properly process those synthetic or those natural organic inputs. So what can you do about it? Well, probably the best thing to do is to start early. In fact, if you're planning on putting a new bed in, probably the best time to do it is at the end of summer. Put that bed in, get a lot of organic stuff put into it. Make sure that you have a good transfer of a good way that soil organisms can come up from the underneath and help inoculate those new beds. So get it ready in the end of summer, cover it up, and forget about it. By the time spring comes around, those beds will be ready to actually plant, and they'll be ready for those organic inputs because they've had plenty of time to establish themselves. Again, I think that's probably the biggest problem that people are having right now, and I see it over and over and over and over again. Why isn't it working? Well, again, it's not working because it's not ready to work. Yep. My next video is going to be about the biodiversity on top of the ground, if you will. This video is more or less about the biodiversity necessary to make organic inputs work under the ground. My next video is going to be the importance of planting a diverse crop in order to ward off pests and to keep everything growing the way that it should be growing. If you got anything out of this video, like, share, and subscribe, and have a great day.